So let me just say a few words about tonight's speaker, S.A. Cosby, who is with us from Southeastern Virginia, so yay, online. Mr. Cosby won the 2019 Anthony Award for Best Short Story for The Grass Beneath My Feet, and his previous books include Brotherhood of the Blade and My Darkest Prayer. His new book, Blacktop Wasteland, is a fantastic read, let me just tell you, and it was blurbed enthusiastically by Lee Child, Dennis Lehane, and Stephen King. But I'm going to briefly quote the review from NPR, which says, S.A. Cosby's latest is being marketed as a crime novel, but that crime is the least important element in a wrenching story about race, family, and the temptation to take that one last job. This is a gritty, violent story, which makes it a good crime tale, but what matters most here, what pushes Blacktop Wasteland into the realm of important novels, is the way it uses a fictional story to deliver truths and discuss history. This is about stealing diamonds and driving away, but it's also about family, risking everything for others, and trying to be the father you wish your father had been. I'm happy to hand the screen to S.A. Cosby to speak about Blacktop Wasteland. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us here. I wanted to send out a special thank you to the New York Society Library for having me. I really appreciate it, and giving me this time to talk about my novel, Blacktop Wasteland. Just to give you an overview of what the book is about, Blacktop Wasteland is the story of a man named Beauregard "Bug" Montage, a auto mechanic, a father, a son, a husband, and in some nefarious circles, known as the best wheelman east of the Mississippi. As the book opens, Beauregard has left that criminal life behind. He started his own business, a small auto repair shop in his hometown of Red Hill County, Virginia, and he's trying to be the best version of himself that he can be. He's trying to take care of his mother, his daughter from a previous relationship, his wife, and his two young sons. But unfortunately, as things are wont to happen in a novel such as this, Beauregard finds himself in tough times. His auto mechanic shop is going under because of new competition in town. His mother, who is in a retirement nursing home facility, is about to be kicked out because of a clerical error with her Medicaid. His daughter from a previous relationship wants to go to college, but unfortunately doesn't have enough tuition to start her first semester. And his two sons and wife need all the things that a family needs. And so Beauregard is tempted by a former criminal associate named Ronnie Sessions to take part in a one last job scenario, the robbery of a small town jewelry store. And unfortunately for Beauregard, that jewelry store belongs to a dangerous and ruthless rural crime lord named Lazy Mothersbaugh. And so on the surface, Blacktop Wasteland is a story that you've probably heard of before. It's a criminal story, a crime story, a noir story, a rural noir story, a tale of hard men, fast cars, and questionable choices. But for me, the underlying motif of Blacktop Wasteland is twofold. It's identity, and it's the story of tragic and toxic masculinity. And what I mean by identity is that throughout the novel, Beauregard finds himself wrestling with the two sides of his nature. On the one hand, he's Beauregard Montage, loving father and husband. But on the other hand, he's Bug, ruthless, brilliant getaway driver and heist planner, feared from the hills of Kentucky to the beaches of Florida. And so he tries to reconcile these two halves of his nature. He's not always successful. He finds himself pulled equally in opposite directions. He wants to be a better father and husband than his own father was, but he cannot find a way to excise himself and relieve himself of his addiction to the speed and thrill of a robbery. And so as the book goes on, these two sides come into constant conflict. And unfortunately, the repercussions are not just felt by Beauregard, but everyone in his circuit and everyone that he holds dear. And when I talk about tragic and toxic masculinity, there's a certain level of immaturity, emotional immaturity in Beauregard. He has a father who disappeared when he was a young boy after a tragic event. And in his effort to understand and in an effort to relate to his father, he puts him on a pedestal that perhaps the father doesn't deserve. And so it's very much emblematic of the sins of the father are visited upon the son. There's a history of violence and criminality in the Montage family that Beauregard desperately wants his sons to avoid. He wants that line to end with him. It's also a story about class and race. I'm from Southeastern Virginia, as was previously said, and I live about 20 minutes from the former capital of the Confederacy, Richmond, Virginia. And so when you talk about the South and you talk about rural issues in rural noir, race and class definitely have to be discussed. And for Beauregard, they're both subtextual. And what I mean by that is no one wants a 300-page sermon. And so when I talk about race and I talk about class in the book, it's through the prism of the characters like Beauregard or Ronnie Sessions, who happens to be a white man, and his brother Reggie, and how they both share a viewpoint of where they come from and the circumstances they've been dealt, but they also diverge at certain points. And so Beauregard has to fight unfair practices in his hometown. You know, his competitor has come into town with a boatload of money and way more equipment and options than Beauregard has at his hometown mom and pop auto repair business. He also has to fight class. Beauregard is a child of poverty, as is Ronnie, as is Reggie, as is many of the denizens of Red Hill. And so when you're fighting these forces that are conspiring to hold you down, it becomes a philosophical discussion. There's an old quote from Winston Churchill that there are people who want you to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but they neglect to see that you don't even have boots. And so that's also a part of the story of Blacktop Wasteland, talking about those defining factors of class, how they separate individuals, how they separate people in the same small town. There's a great sense of camaraderie when you grow up in a small town, but there's also a sense of restlessness. There is an idea that you don't have access to your own privacy. In small towns, everyone knows everyone. And so through 6 degrees of separation, you're pretty much in touch with everyone in your community, for good or for ill. And so as Beauregard tries to change, tries to be a better person, tries to be a better father, he is constantly reminded of the person he used to be. Now, that's not always the fault of those around him. There's a certain amount of hubris in him. And as I spoke of earlier, there's a certain amount of emotional immaturity in him as a man, because he's not able to let go of the things that he held dear that are not conducive to having a healthy, full life as an adult. I believe that Beauregard is like a lot of people. We look at the past through rose-colored glasses and the sheen of nostalgia. And that sometimes keeps us from growing and maturing and being the full best version of ourselves that we can be. And so when we talk about those issues, I like to liken the book to someone getting a little honey to make the medicine go down. Because I do talk about those issues, but there's also, exciting action. There's violence. There's raw emotion in the book. Everything that I put in the book are things that I take very dearly: family, love, hope, faith, trust, anger, rage, the desire to escape your small town trappings, the desire to achieve your part of the American dream. And so the book was very personal for me. My mother and father separated when I was a young man, and I did not have the best relationship with my father, although thankfully we've been able to repair it. And so it was a catharsis for me in some ways to be able to write those feelings and emotions down and use the avatar of Beauregard to speak about things that are very, very important to me on a personal human level. But also I wanted people to enjoy the story. I want people to enjoy the book. I want people to walk away from the book having thought about important issues and the larger ideas and the big picture issues. But I also want them to have enjoyed the experience, have enjoyed going along with Beauregard for the ride. So some folks always ask me, where did I get the idea for Blacktop Wasteland? And so when I was a young man, I had a cousin, a relative of mine that I loved very much. He's no longer with us. And I used to call him the Mozart of motors. He was just a mechanical genius, self-taught, never took any training, went to any technical school. And when I was way too young, about 12 or 13, I would sneak out at night and go and join him. And we would go to the other side of town, and we would go to impromptu, illegal drag races. But the main thing that I took away from those drag races wasn't so much the illegality of it or the danger, which that was a part of it. Of course, I was a young man, a teenager, and so danger was, of course, an alluring aspect of the evening. But the main thing that I took from it was the sense of freedom that it inspired in the folks who were there. Better writers and better philosophers than I have talked about America's love affair with the automobile. But I will say this, that I do think there's a sense of unfettered joy that you can get behind the wheel of a car. There's an incredible wealth of possibilities when you have a full tank of gas and, 4 on the floor and a nice 405 Mopar Slant 6 engine under the hood. That the car can take you anywhere, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. There's just an incredible sense of euphoria seeing everything that you know, everything that you've ever known in your rearview mirror. And I think that's why Americans are in love with cars. It's the vehicle, no pun intended, for transformation, for reinvention, for self-awareness. And so as a young boy, I wasn't thinking any of these thoughts. But as I got older and became more serious about my writing, these things were very important to me, and I had a desire to articulate them. There's a great song by Bruce Springsteen called Jungle Land, and it tells the story of drag racers in New Jersey, which aren't that different from drag racers in the South. And it's a very melancholy, sad song, but ultimately hopeful song. And I wanted to distill everything that I loved about a song like Jungle Land and everything that I loved about a film like Hell or High Water, which tells the story of 2 brothers fighting poverty in eastern Texas. And I wanted to take everything that I loved about those creative endeavors and put it into the book. And hopefully, I hope I succeeded. One of the things that I like to, when people ask me about the book, is they like to ask me, how did I get my book deal? How did this come about? And so if you'll indulge me, I'll tell a very quick story. Back in 2018, I was on the cusp of releasing a novel called My Darkest Prayer through an independent publisher named Intrigue Publishing. And so in advance of that, I saved all my money and scraped all my pennies together to go down to South Florida, to St. Petersburg, to the annual BoucherCon Mystery Convention. And I was going 75% a fan, maybe 25% author. It was just a plethora of great writers that I wanted to meet and listen to and sit at the base of their learning tree. And so I went to Florida for the event, and a friend of mine who was there, Eric Pruitt, was the moderator for a Southern crime fiction panel. And he asked me would I like to attend the panel, would I like to be on the panel? And I was very grateful for that opportunity. I was not a very well-known writer at all. I published a few short stories, and My Darkest Prayer was my first crime novel. I had written a couple of fantasy novels. And so once we got on the panel, I was on the panel with such literary luminaries as Ace Atkins, the author of the Quinn Colson series, but also the current author of the Robert Parker Spencer series. I was on there with Steph Post, the author of incredible books about South Florida, like Lightwood and Miraculum, an incredible writer. And I was also on there with Alex Segura, who is a multi-talented author who works in the comic book industry, but also was the author of the Pete Fernandez mystery series. He just finished writing a tie-in with the Poe Dameron character for Star Wars. And of course, my friend Eric Pruitt, who's a writer and filmmaker from North Carolina himself, author of the Anthony-nominated What We Reckon. And so this quintuplet of Southern writers had an incredibly moving and honest conversation about what it means to be a writer from the South and what it means to write about class, race, poverty, and politics under the shadow of the former Confederacy. And so at the end of the event, a person stood up and said they didn't have a comment, they had a question. And anyone who's ever been on a panel or been to a convention, I think is fully aware that that is going to be an interesting 2 to 5 minutes. And so that person basically reiterated their belief that things during the antebellum time of the South were not that bad. And so I was able to answer her query with a little humor and a little sarcasm. And so immediately after that panel, a gentleman walked up to me and held out his hand, and he said, "My name is Josh Gessler, and I'd love to work with you. Are you working on anything currently?" And that was Blacktop Wasteland. And so about 3 months later, I was signed to a 2-book deal with the great folks at Flatiron Books, which is an imprint of Macmillan Publishing. So it all goes to prove you just have to be in the right place at the right time. I think that's a huge part of any creative endeavor. And so I've been incredibly moved by the response to Blacktop Wasteland. Some authors that I have on my Mount Rushmore of great writers have said very, very kind, incredibly humbling things about the book. I'd like to tell people that if I can do it, anybody can do it. I'm just a country boy from the hills and lowlands of southeastern Virginia. I'm a college dropout. I've worked a numerous amount of jobs, and I've never been good at any of them except for writing. It's the one thing that I feel that I was put on the earth to do, and I feel that is the one thing that I can do moderately well. I think that's no false humility. I'm in awe of other writers. I'm always finding new writers that blow my mind, that do things and say things and construct sentences in ways that I would never think to. And I am constantly inspired to be a better writer because of that. So I think what I'll do now is I will read from the first chapter of Blacktop Wasteland to give you, anyone who hasn't read the book, to give you a taste of what the book entails. And I will censor some of the, as my mom says, there's a lot of salty language in the book, so I will censor it myself to a certain extent if there's any little ears joining us tonight. So first chapter of Blacktop Wasteland. Shepherd's Hill, Virginia, 2012. Beauregard thought the night sky looked like a painting. Laughter filled the air only to be drowned out by a cacophony of revving engines as the moon slid from behind the clouds. The bass from the sound system of a nearby Chevelle was hitting him in the chest so hard it felt like someone was performing CPR on him. There were about a dozen other late model cars parked haphazardly in front of the old convenience store. In addition to the Chevelle, there was a Maverick, 2 Impalas, a few Camaros, and 5 or 6 more examples of the heyday of American muscle. The air was cool and filled with the scent of gas and oil, the rich, acrid smell of exhaust fumes and burnt rubber. A choir of crickets and whippoorwills tried in vain to be heard. Beauregard closed his eyes and strained his ears. He could hear them, but just barely. They were screaming for love. He thought a lot of people spent a large part of their life doing the same thing. The wind caught the sign hanging above his head from the arm of a pole that extended 20 feet into the air. It creaked as the breeze moved it back and forth. Carter Speedy Mart, the sign proclaimed, in big black letters set against a white background. The sign was beginning to yellow with age, and the letters were worn and chipped, the cheap paint flaking away like dried skin. The second E had disappeared from the word entirely. Beauregard wondered what had happened to Carter. He wondered if he had disappeared too. Man, ain't none of y'all ready for the legendary O's. Y'all might as well go home to your ugly wives. For real though, y'all ain't got nothing for the legendary O's. She does 60 in second. $500 line to line. Huh? Y'all mighty quiet. Come on, the O's done sent a mini boy home with his pockets lighter. I done outrunning more cops than the Duke boys and the O's. You ain't just beating the O's, homeboy, a guy named Warren Crocker crowed. He was strutting around his 76 Oldsmobile Cutlass. It was a beautiful car. dark green body with chrome mag rims and chrome trim that ran along its surface like liquid lightning. Smoked out glass and LED lights emitted an ethereal bluish glow like some bioluminescent sea creature. Beauregard leaned against his duster as Warren pontificated about the invincibility of the Oldsmobile. Beauregard let him talk. Talk didn't mean anything. Talk didn't drive the car. Talk was just noise. He had $1,000 in his pocket. It was all the profits from the last 2 weeks at the garage after most of the bills had been paid. He was $800 short on the rent for the building that housed his business. It had come down to a choice between the rent or glasses for his youngest, which wasn't really a choice at all. So he had reached out to his cousin Kelvin and asked him to find out where the nearest street race was being held. Kelvin still knew some guys who knew where the money races could be found. And that was how they found themselves just outside of Dinwiddie County, 10 miles from the fairgrounds where legally sanctioned drag races were held. Beauregard closed his eyes again. He listened to Warren's car idle. Under the sound of the boasting, Beauregard heard an unmistakable ticking. Warren had a bad valve in his engine. Now that left two possibilities. He knew about it, but thought it was an acceptable defect that could be overcome by the sheer power of his motor. Maybe he had a nitrous boost on it and he didn't care about one funky valve. Or he didn't know and was just talking a lot of shit. Beauregard nodded at Kelvin. His cousin had been milling through the crowd, trying to drum up a big money race. There had already been 4 contests, but no one was willing to put up more than $300. That wasn't going to cut it. Bo needed at least $1,000 bet. He needed someone who would look at the duster and see an easy payday. Look at its stripped down exterior and assume it was a pushover. He needed someone like Warren Crocker. Crocker had already won one race, but that had taken place before Beauregard and Kelvin had arrived. Ideally, he would have liked to watch the man drive before he made the bet. See how he handled the wheel, how he navigated the cracked asphalt on this stretch of Route 83. But beggars can't be choosers. It had taken them an hour and a half to get out here, but they had come because Beauregard knew no one in Red Hill would race him. Not in the duster. Kelvin moved in front of Warren as he was preening around his car. My man over there got 10 friends that say he could be doing 70 in second, while you still trying to drag your ass out of first, he said. He let his booming voice fill the night. All the chatter ceased. The crickets and the whippoorwills were working themselves into a frenzy. Or is all you do is talk? Beauregard asked. Oh, shit, someone from the crowd at a gathered said. Warren stopped strutting and leaned up on the roof of his car. He was tall and thin. His dark skin appeared blue in the glow of the moonlight. Well, that's a bold statement. You got the paper to back it up, he said. Beauregard pulled his wallet out and fanned 10 more $100 bills out like a deck of cards in his large hands. The question is, do you have the balls to back it up? Kelvin said. He sounded like a quiet storm DJ, and he grinned like a lunatic at Warren Crocker. Crocker tucked his tongue into the inside of his cheek. Seconds ticked by, Beauregard felt a hollow opening bloom in his chest. He could see the gears working in Warren's head, and for a moment he thought he was going to pass. But Beauregard knew he wouldn't. How could he? He had talked himself into a corner, and his pride wouldn't let him back down. Besides, the duster didn't look that impressive. I mean, it was clean, and the body was free of rust, but the red candy apple paint was not sure and ready, and the leather seats had a few rips and cracks. All right. From here to the oak tree that split down the middle. Sherm can hold the money, unless you want to go for pinks, Warren said. No, let him hold the money. Who you want to call it? Beauregard asked. Sherm nodded at another guy. Me and Jamie will call it. You want your boy to go too? He said. He squeaked when he talked. Yeah, Beauregard said. Kelvin, Sherm, and Jamie hopped in Sherm's car, a primer-covered Nova. They took off for the split tree a quarter mile down the road. Beauregard hadn't seen any other drivers since they had arrived. Most people avoided this stretch and used the 4-lane highway that snaked its way from the interstate up through Shepherd's Corner proper. Progress had left this part of town behind. It was abandoned just like the store, a blacktop wasteland haunted by the phantoms of the past. He turned and got in the duster. When he started the car, the engine sounded like a pride of angry lions. Vibrations traveled up from the motor through the steering wheel. He tapped the gas a few times, and the lions became dragons. He flicked on the headlights. The double yellow line down the middle of the road came alive. He grabbed the gear shift and put it into first. Warren pulled out of the parking lot, and Beauregard took a position next to him. One of the other guys that was in the crowd walked up and stood between them. He held his arm up and reached for the sky. Beauregard glanced at the stars and the moon again. Out of the corner of his eyes, he saw Warren put on a seatbelt. The duster didn't have seatbelts. His father used to say if they ever wrecked, the only thing seatbelts would do would make it hard for the undertaker to get them out of the car. "You ready?" The guy standing between them yelled. Warren gave a thumbs up. Beauregard nodded. "1, 2, 3, the guy screamed. "The secret ain't about the motor. Yeah, that's part of it, but that ain't the main thing. The real thing, the thing that most people don't want to talk about, is how you drive. If you drive like you're scared, you're going to lose. If you drive like you don't want to have to rebuild the whole engine, you're going to lose. You got to drive like nothing else matters except getting to that line. You got to drive like you stole it." Beauregard heard his daddy's voice every time he drove the duster. Sometimes he heard it when he was driving for crews. In those moments, it offered him bitter pearls of wisdom, nonsensical chatter that reminded him not to end up like his daddy, a ghost without a grave. Beauregard slammed the gas pedal to the floor. Wheels spun and white smoke plumed up from the rear of the duster. G-forces pressed against his chest, crushing his sternum. Warren's car jumped off the line and the front two wheels left the road. Beauregard jammed the car into second as the duster's front wheels grabbed the road like a pair of eagle's talons. The trees on both sides of the roads were shimmering blurs as he tore down through the night. He glanced at the speedometer, 70 miles per hour. Beauregard hit the clutch and shifted into third. There were no numbers on the gear shift knob. It was so old, it was an old 8-ball that his daddy had fixed to the top of the shifter. He didn't need numbers. He knew where the gears were by feel, by sound. The car shivered like a wolf shaking its pelt, 90 miles per hour. The leather-covered steel steering wheel crackled in his grip. He could see Sherm's car up ahead idling on the side of the road. He shifted into fourth gear. The motor went from a roar to the war cry of a god. The duels were the trumpet that heralded his arrival. He had the pedal flat against the floorboard. The car seemed to contort itself and leap forward like a snake about to strike. The speedometer hit 105 miles per hour. The duster passed Warren like he was mired in glue. The old bisected oak tree was rapidly receding in his rearview mirror. He could see Kelvin pumping both fists. Beauregard popped the clutch and downshifted until he was back in first. He slowed down even more, executed a three-point turn, and headed back to the old convenience store. So that's the section from the first part of the book. Beauregard has gone to a illegal street race to try to raise some money for his automobiles, the rent for his automobile shop. And there's a twist coming that I don't want to give away for anyone that hasn't read the book. But that scene was inspired directly by my memories of going to the street races with my cousin Haywood and my other cousin George and all the guys that hung out there in their Bel Airs and Mustangs and Impalas, and all the classics of the late model American muscle period in automobiles. The one thing that I like to say about Blacktop Wasteland is that, yes, it's violent. It's at times brutally violent. But I think the main thing about the book, I think the thing that has resonated with people, the thing that I hoped would resonate with people, is the family dynamic. At its core, it's a story about family. And it's a story about the family we choose and the family we're born with, and how we're able to navigate those treacherous highways and byways of familiar interpersonal relations. For all his bluster, for all his toughness, in his heart, Beauregard just wants to be a good father. He just wants to be a good husband, a good son. He wants to make sure that everyone that he cares about is taken care of. And so he's able to compartmentalize the horrible and horrific things that he does, because at the end of the day, he just wants the best for the people that he loves. And I think that's the thing that has resonated with a lot of folks, is that despite some of the incredibly terrible things that he does, or incredibly dangerous situations that he finds himself in, he's doing that for the love of his family. I think one of the things that I like to say about noir and crime, rural noir or noir in general, whether you're talking about Raymond Chandler and Ross McDonald, or whether you're talking about Walter Mosley or Chester Himes, is that the noir novel as a construct is filled with troubled, broken people doing terrible things for the right reason. And I think that's definitely true of the characters in Blacktop Wasteland. I grew up as a fan of all types of reading, all types of genre, everything from nonfiction biographies of Peter the Great and Alexander the Great and Marie Curie and Louis Pasteur, or English drawing room mysteries like Dorothy L. Sayers and Agatha Christie and P.D. James, or hardcore horror novels by Stephen King, Clive Barker, Ramsey Campbell, Robert McCammon, or the Gothic novel, popularized by Daphne du Maurier, or the early works of Edgar Allan Poe, Ambrose Bierce, everything down to the rural fatalism of Jim Thompson. And so I draw from a wide variety of subjects and a wide variety of writers and books. And I try to use all of that to create compelling, interesting characters and compelling, interesting plots. I think every writer has weaknesses and strengths. I don't have the most original plots, but I do try to use dialogue to advance that plot. I love listening to people talk. That's one thing with the pandemic that I miss. I really miss being able to go to a bar or a restaurant and just listening to the way people conversate, the pauses in conversation, how people talk over each other, unintentionally or intentionally. Some of the most powerful soliloquies I've ever heard were in a bar, sitting at the corner, listening to someone talk about a love affair gone wrong. And so I try to replicate that in my writing. I try to replicate that in my dialogue. My editor would tell you I have a fatal fascination with ellipses, but I do that as a technical craft motif to try to replicate the way people really speak. I think that's the most potent way to drive a story forward. I think the noir novel, in its classic sense, is a novel of the city. It's a novel, the mean streets of New York, or the Technicolor dreamscape of 1950s Los Angeles. But I think there's room to expand it. I think there's writers who have done an amazing job of taking, the noir motifs and the fatalism of, say, James M. Cain, and taking it out of Southern California and dropping it in the Ozarks with, like, for instance, Daniel Woodrell and his the novels Winter Bone and his country noir series, or a writer like David Joy and his Appalachian novels. Writers who are bringing that motif and that sensibility to rural America. I think that's a good thing. I think there's a multitude of an incredibly fascinating amount of stories to be told through the lens of the noir story in a small town. I often say, it's scary to walk down a dark alley in the middle of the night, in a big city, but it's terrifying to find yourself on a country road in the middle of the night and there's no moon in the sky and you see a pair of headlights slowly approaching you. And so I think there's a rich and deep well of fiction that can be mined from those areas. And I think also when you talk about the human condition in small towns, in places like my hometown, where a lot of the industries have dried up or moved overseas, where people feel lost, they feel adrift, and they find themselves doing things out of not just boredom, but out of a sense of malaise, a strange sense of ennui, coupled with just unmitigating and unrelenting sadness and depression. And so I tell my stories for those people. I think also that there's a rural component that a lot of people tend to not appreciate or overlook, is the rural Black experience. There's I've said this before, that there are times where I have more in common with a white man from Georgia or from South Carolina or North Carolina than I have with anyone else anywhere else in the country. And I think there's a mistaken belief that the rural Black experience is just one of suffering, is just one of agony and soul-crushing despair. And it's not. I am a Southerner by birth. And I think there's a mistaken idea that Southern tradition is the sole providence of neo-Confederate apologists and New Age racists. And it is not. If nothing else, if I do nothing else with my writing, I want people to understand that I will not concede 1 inch of ground on this idea. The history of the South is not just the history of Jeb Stuart and Robert E. Lee. It's the history of people like my great-great-grandmother, who was born a slave and lived long enough to see herself be free. It is the history of men and women in my family and other African-American families in the South who have fought and died and spilled their blood so that their children could walk across that same ground their blood dropped on as free men and women. And with our country in the state that it is right now, I think that perspective is more important than ever. Not just my perspective, but any perspective that is proffered by a person of color in a rural state or rural area. Again, I think there's this idea among some people that flyover states, so to speak, are only inhabited by far-right extremists, and nothing could be further from the truth. I love where I'm from. I love the South, but I'm also fully aware that it is both beautiful and grotesque. And my job as a writer is to highlight the beauty and show you the grotesqueness and show you where the characters live in between those two extremes, because that's where the best stories are in the middle between pathos and joy, between agony and ecstasy. That's where all the best writing lives, in my opinion. And so I see there it's 6:45. I just wanted to say again, thank you to the New York Society Library for having me and allowing me to discuss my book, Blacktop Wasteland. I'm just overjoyed with the response to the novel. I'm very proud of the book, and I'm incredibly, incredibly humbled by all the wonderful messages and emails and comments that I received. It means the world to me. I grew up very, very poor. I was 16 years old before we got indoor plumbing. And we lived with my grandparents, and my grandfather couldn't read. And my grandmother was a voracious reader. And I would watch her read the newspaper to him, read stories out of Time magazine and Newsweek to him. I would watch her read stories from her Harlequin romances, which he wasn't a great fan of. But the sense of joy that I saw her inspire in him when she would read to him, and the sense of the incredible connection that they had as a couple, really inspired me to one day tell stories of my own. I wanted that connection. I wanted that wanted to see or feel or experience that type of connection with as many people as possible. The thing about being a writer is writing is like telling yourself a joke for 9 months and then hoping everybody gets the punchline. And you don't know. It can be a lonely endeavor, but you're never alone when you're doing it. I have lots of friends, fellow writers that I talk to, but ultimately being a writer is a solo job, but I love it and I wouldn't want to do anything else. And if this book has given you one moment of joy or peace or escapism, I wanted to tell you that you have my sincere thanks. It means everything to me. So I didn't know if there were any questions that anyone wanted to have answered, but I guess we could do that at this time.
Yeah. Thank you so much. That's absolutely brilliant. And I just want to read aloud a couple of good things that we have in the chat here. Somebody says, what a great reader. What a great writer. And another person adds, amen, Sean. That was particularly in response to talking about the South as a setting and people's assumptions about it. It's fantastic. So I'm just going to jump back in here with sound, if that's okay, and mention a couple of questions that we have here in the chat. So thank you, folks, for adding that in. If anybody else has things they'd like to add to the chat, go ahead and do so. So a question, how do you decide on the names of your characters?
So with Beauregard, I did that specifically. Beauregard has become a cliche Southern name for any number of Southern fictional or real life Confederate soldiers or generals or Colonel Sanders type caricatures in modern fiction. And so I wanted to use that name specifically. I wanted to give it to an African-American character. And I wanted, in essence, as I'm trying to reclaim Southern history, I wanted to reclaim that name. And so that was a specific choice. Other times I will just flip through. I have copies of old phone books. Don't ask me why, I'm a pack rat. And I will just flip through and just put my finger on a name. And if it sounds right, if it feels right, then I'll use it. Mark Twain once said, when it comes to writing, the difference between the right word and the wrong word is the difference between lightning and lightning bug. And I definitely agree with that. I can't explain it, but when you're a writer, you just know when the right word is in the right place. And the same is true for names.
That's great. So a question, going back to what you said earlier about writing about race and class, but nobody wants to read a 300-page lecture. When you live below the poverty line, every single conversation you have all day can revolve on some level around money. But for readers who've never been poor, this is hard to believe. How did you balance accurate portrayal with this not needing to come off as a sermon? Were you more conscious of this while writing, or was it something you and outside readers had to talk about in edits?
It was a combination. And during this writing, the rough draft, I definitely created situations that were, emblematic of growing up in a poverty or a poor environment. There's a line in the book that Ronnie actually says, one of the secondary antagonists, when you're poor, every phone call is full of doom, because you don't know if it's somebody calling to tell you that the car's broke down. You don't know if it's somebody calling to tell you they've got fired. And I've lived that experience. And so what I wanted to do was sprinkle it in such a way that a person who hasn't lived that experience would understand the fear and how stressful living like that is. Being poor is physically stressful. And so I wanted to kind of intersperse that periodically. At the same time, I didn't want it to detract from the overall story. And so, it's the old show don't tell mantra. And so when you go to Ronnie's house and I describe how, threadbare and worn his couch is, or when we see Beauregard talking with his family, when he does come on upon some money, he doesn't take them to Disney World, or they don't go to the Champs-Élysées. He goes to the store and buys Delmonico steaks, because when you're poor, $20 steaks is a delicacy. And so things like that, I just wanted to drop them in periodically. When I had beta readers, when I had my editor look at it, there were some things that we turned up and some things that we toned down in reference to creating that sense of atmosphere. But it's always a work in progress.
Who is reading you, and what has been your hometown response?
So my mom, first things first, I want to tell everyone because my mom will be mad if I don't. The mother in the book, Ella, is not my mother. She's not at all. She wasn't inspired by my mom. There are certain physical characteristics I use, but my mom is not as bad as the mom in the book. But my mom loved the book, but she, as I said previously, she doesn't like the salty language. My hometown newspaper has been so supportive. The Gazette Journal in Matthews County, Virginia, has been so supportive of the book. And I have a very, very minuscule amount of celebrity in my hometown now. So if I'm at the gas station or I'm at the Walmart, people will either tell me they're going to get the book or they've gotten the book. So it's been an interesting experience. I'm not an extrovert by any means, but it has been kind of unique. Going to the pharmacy and the pharmacist is yelling over the plexiglass. I loved your book. When's part 2? And so it's been a different experience for me. Definitely. But the support from the one great thing about coming from a whole small town is, like I said, everybody. So everyone's been super supportive. I cannot overstate how just incredibly supportive and kind the people in my hometown have been in regards to the book.
That's great to hear. So someone asks, well, and I wanted to add, I really appreciated your naming many of the authors and creators who've inspired you. I wanted to scramble to write them all down. But someone asks, what have you been reading or watching recently, presumably that you'd recommend?
I just finished watching, and I read the book. I watched The Devil All the Time, based on the book by Donald Ray Pollock, starring Robert Pattinson and the actor, he plays Spider-Man. The actor from Spider-Man, I'm sorry. That movie for me was incredible. I really enjoyed it. Right now, I'm in the midst of reading When These Mountains Burn by David Joy, an incredible, I hesitate to call it a crime novel. It's a literary crime novel that takes place in southern Appalachian part of North Carolina. I'm also currently finishing up, and I know I'm late to the party, The Secret History by Donna Tartt, which is just that's the kind of book that you read and it makes you think, I should stop writing because I'll never write anything this good. It's an amazing book. And I also just finished a book that I'd love to give a shout out to. If anyone that read Blacktop Wasteland is looking for another novel in that same kind of genre and vein that talks about social and personal issues, but also has a great crime story, Winter Counts by David Heskell-Winobly Whedon, an indigenous writer and professor. That book is an incredible tour de force of just brutally honest fiction. And so I really want to give a shout out to that.
An attendee says, I loved your novel. It's my favorite of the year. How did you write or come up with the getaway scenes? And I'm not all that into cars, but you had me riveted to the page during those scenes, and I would endorse that sentiment too. And then someone else asked, yes, and what do you drive?
Okay, so first part, I have, I'll answer that question like this. In my misspent youth, I used to have a 76 Oldsmobile Cutlass, just like Warren Crocker in the book. And I got 2 speeding tickets in the same day. So that'll tell you a little bit about my experience driving fast. Currently, I am driving a dad SUV. I have a Ford SUV, but my dream car that I want, that I would love to get one day, is the classic 70 Chevelle. It's a beautiful car. I would love to have one of those one day and just get it really, just get it really, as we say down my way, get it toned up nice and tight. I would love to have a car like that. But no, I have a suburban Warrior vehicle that I just take I don't do anything exciting in my own car. I just take the groceries back and forth to the store. So that's about it.
going to toss in one more question, and if anybody else has anything else they'd like to add, feel free to drop it in the chat, but we're going to kind of draw to a close here. So there's a wonderful passage in the middle of the book where Beauregard is talking to his son and telling him to stay in school and get an education. And he says, listen, when you're a Black man in America, you live with the weight of people's low expectations on your back every day. Everybody else has a head start in a race and you're dragging low expectations behind you. Choices give you freedom from those expectations, because that's what freedom is, being able to let things go, and nothing is more important than freedom. And I mean, this is a very moving observation and well said. It also struck me, though, that it addresses part of the structure of the book, because part of what happens is each time you meet a new layer of characters, it seems like they're making choices, but they feel like they have their backs against the wall and they don't have any choices. Can you talk a little bit about that element of things, in particular how you use that to build the suspense, because that was a...
Right. I'll very quickly. So Beauregard is one of the instances where we're able to tell someone or give someone advice that we ourselves can't take. Beauregard has choices. Early on in the book, when they're facing these financial difficulties, his wife is telling him, sell the duster. The duster belonged to your dad. I know it means a lot to you, but sell the car. He makes a choice that he won't sell the car. And it's an immature choice. I'm very strong on that idea that there's this level of emotional immaturity that Beauregard possesses, because as a friend of mine said, the great author Kelly Garrett, author of Hollywood Homicide, she said, after she beta read it, she's like, if Beauregard just listened to his wife, this book would be 7 pages long. And so and it's true. I think that Beauregard and Ronnie and all the characters in the book, they compartmentalize their situation and convince themselves that they have no choices, when ultimately they do. They choose to do the things that they do. Now, they don't have choices and they don't have control of the repercussions, but they definitely make conscious decisions. And that, some of Beauregard's issues come from a sense of hubris. As a character, Beauregard is very competent. He knows that most of the times he's the smartest person in the room. However, that also leads, sometimes your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. And one of his greatest strengths is his confidence in himself, but it also becomes his greatest weakness. Because of his confidence in himself, he makes choices that are ultimately self-destructive. And I think that's relatable to a lot of folks. I think it's relatable to a lot of us, that we make poor choices in our lives and then we try to explain away the repercussions of those choices. And hopefully, as you grow as a person, as you grow as a human being, you'll stop making poor choices and stop trying to explain those repercussions and accept that you have decided the path that you're going to take, no one else. And I definitely believe that as a personal mantra. I've made a lot of poor choices in my life, and I've learned to take responsibility for those choices. And sometimes people like Beauregard, they don't learn that. They have to learn that the hard way, unfortunately.
But one real quick thing, can you repeat the title of the last novel you mentioned on the previous question? Winter
Counts. Winter and like count, Counts. And it's a great, great novel by my friend David Heskell-Winobly-Whedon, and great indigenous writer. And he's also a college professor. And he's also an incredibly nice man that we got to meet in person in the before times last year at VoucherCon. But the book itself is just a wonder. It takes place in and around a Native American reservation with a magnificent lead character who's complicated and flawed, but also ultimately heroic. And I couldn't recommend it higher.
Terrific. But thank you so much. I think we'll draw to a close there. We really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who joined us. If you want to glance in the chat just now and click on one of those last 2 links, that's to purchase your copy of Blacktop Wasteland, which you really must read all of. I highly recommend it. From our friends at the Corner Bookstore, if you want to take our event attendee survey, that's that last link there. So thank you so much for joining us on behalf of the New York Society Library. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Take care.